The location of the Indian Ocean made the crossroads for the commercial and cultural exchanges between China, India, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. Trade rapidly grew over the centuries due to the aggression of merchants in cosmopolitan port cities. Mutual self-interest had regulated violence along with the attempts to monopolize trade. The South China Sea became the most developed commercial trading post. The access of China to the west was permitted by Mongol emperors, encouraging Europeans such as Marco Polo to venture there. China crossed the threshold of commercial expansion, agriculture achievement, population growth, and urbanization when the Ming Dynasty emerged in the 1368. At least until the 17th century, China was known as the most advanced economy in the world. Through his 7 voyages and notorious navy, Admiral Zhang He established China's lead in exploration. However, exploration was abruptly halted due to the need to defense from renewed Mongol encroachment. Abandoning their position as the top external trade power, new opportunities for European states were suddenly available. India served as a crucial link between the Persian Gulf and the Southeast Asian and East Asian trade networks, as well as a significant contributor in the world's trading system. During the mid-1400s, Africa consisted of numerous small states and only a few large developed empires. The focal point of Islamic learning and religious power was found in Cairo. It also served as a trade post for the Indian Ocean trade. Cultural trade centers in Africa included Ethiopia as well. Transported on camels across the Sahara Desert, gold from West Africa was a significant African contributor to the world trade. Inland nations grew wealthy from the north-south trade routes established. Along with gold, slaves functioned as one of the most important contributors to the African continent. Arabic and African merchants took West African slaves to the Mediterranean to be sold in Europeans to West Africa as slaves. The Persian Safavids and the Turkish Ottomans, 2 rival empires, controlled the Middle East region politically, economically, and religiously. While the 2 empires competed for power over western trade routes to the east, in the end, the Ottomans were able to take control of the routes. Genoa's trade operations were opened in Cairo, a gateway to Asian trade, when Venice stabilized formal relationships with the Sultan of Mamluk Egypt in 1304. Venetian merchants specialized in expensive luxury goods like spices, silks, and carpets. Venetians compensated the low desire of European goods from the east through developing trade in firearms, slaves, and precious metals. Venice's ancient rival, Genoa, shifted focus from trade to financing, focusing in on the western Mediterranean. When Venice claimed victory in the spice trade in the 1400s, Genoese merchants, navigators, and financiers offered their knowledge to the Iberian monarchs when the Spanish and Portuguese voyagers began to explore the western Atlantic. In return for a share of the profits, merchants from Genoa would eventually help finance and colonize the Spanish in the New World. Slavery operated as a major trade component in both Venetian and Genoese markets. They were purchased in the Balkans and sold into numerous Mediterranean ports. After the loss of the Black Seas, and thus numerous sources of slaves to the Ottomans, the Genoese sought new supplies of slaves in the west, taking indigenous peoples from the Canary Islands, Muslim prisoners, and Jewish refugees from Spain, and by the early 1500s both black and Berber Africans. Ultimately, both Genoa and Venice became vital participants in the Atlantic slave trade. Europeans found in the mid-15th century the need to discover new lands to trade with and conquer. This happened for several reasons in the 15th century. First, the Europeans had finally managed to revive their economy after years of depression occurring after the Black Death. With a suddenly increasing economy, the Europeans wanted to trade with China, India, and Africa for several items that were not available in Europe at the time. Europe soon lost many trade routes with China and India once the Ottomans captured Constantinople from the Byzantines. Europe desperately wanted spices from India, but the trade route now closed, it appeared that they were cut off from their very dear luxury. These new longer-scale voyages the countries were investing in were only possible because of rapid naval technological improvements. Ships before the 15th century were mostly galleys, which were propelled by huge amounts of slaves. The new Portuguese invention of the caravel greatly helped the ocean travel. The caravel was a light three-mast ship, but it was slower, but it could also hold more cargo, and it was also more maneuverable. Along with the caravel came with new developments in cartography and navigation, which also helped overseas travel. Some of the most important developments were the astrolabe, which allowed sailors to calculate their position according to the position of the sun and stars, the magnetic compass to determine their direction and position, and the Laotian sail, an Indian invention that allowed ships to tack against the wind. Portugal had some of the most important contributions to overseas exploration. Portugal was a small and relatively poor nation that was surrounded totally by Spain and the sea. These conditions set Portugal to invest much into sea trade. The Portuguese Prince Henry contributed much to the support and financing towards exploration and a way to get around Africa and possibly into Asia. Portugal started to claim many seaports along the African coast to start their overseas expansions. These colonies gave Portugal an additional source of slaves and gold and made them a major financial leader in Europe. Finally, after many expeditions, Vasco da Gama finally managed to round the Cape and proceed into the Indian port of Calicut. Vasco da Gama experienced much local hostility, but he still managed to return to Portugal with Indian cloth. Many expeditions inland led to many bitter meetings with Muslim merchants that controlled the trade and were very hostile towards the views of Europe. In several cases, Portugal would take a trading town by force and force the people to trade with them. A Genoese mariner by the name of Christopher Columbus went to several wealthy people, asking them to sponsor an expedition led by him to find a trade route to China. After many rejections, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain agreed to sponsor him. His idea was to find a direct ocean trading route to the Indies. His idea didn't go exactly as planned. Christopher Columbus instead landed in the Caribbean. The Spanish came to America with a policy of complete conquest of every native people. They found there the Aztecs, who were ruled by Montezuma II, and their cities had huge populations which were often bigger than major European cities. The Spanish used the internal conflicts of the native people and the recent spreading of the European disease of smallpox to take advantage of them and ultimately conquer them. The Spanish then plundered many of their cities and took many of their resources for themselves. They subjugated many lands and would use the indigenous people as slaves. However, Spain and Portugal both had claims to the Americas. To resolve this problem, they went to Pope Alexander VI. Their meeting brought about the Treaty of Tordesillas. This gave Spain everything west of a line drawn down the Atlantic, and Portugal everything to the east. Spain ended up getting the worst part of the deal for a time. The Portuguese made massive profit from their claims in Brazil, while Spain made comparably less than Portugal. Spain desperately wanted to find their ways to Asia, and hired Ferdinand Magellan to find a sea route to the spices of Asia. Spain divided their newly conquered land into 4 viceroyalties: New Spain, Peru, New Granada, and La Plata. The system of intendants was introduced by the Spanish King Charles III. These royal officials possessed broad military, administrative, and financial authority. They were responsible not to the viceroy of the territories, but to the monarchy in Madrid. The French used a similar system in governing their overseas colonies. The Portuguese used the same system in their colony in Brazil. Spanish administrative forms were introduced. Local officials called corregidores held judicial and military power. Royal policies placed severe restrictions on Brazilian industries. This was meant to prevent competition between those of Portugal or Spain. Before Columbus, the Americas were inhabited by thousands of groups of indigenous peoples. They had many different languages and cultures, and there were about 5 million of them. Thousands of Spanish men carved out vast estates called haciendas. They imported Spanish livestock and had huge sugar plantations for the European market. The Spanish started to use the encomienda system. The Spanish used the indigenous people to work the cattle ranches, sugar plantations, and silver mines. The system gave the Crown's approval to employ groups of Native Americans, or they could demand tribute from the natives in return for shelter and food. In truth, the system was a legalized form of slavery. There was also a massive loss of indigenous people. One cause was disease. The diseases such as smallpox, influenza, typhus, and others killed many Native Americans. This was because they had no natural resistance to them. Another cause was overworking. Often, overworking the indigenous people in the blistering heat of the tropical cane fields caused death. Also, the forced labor of the indigenous people diverted people from agricultural work. This caused malnutrition, starvation, and lowered resistance to diseases. Many people died in violence brought on by war as well. Franciscan Bartolomeo de las Casas was the most outspoken critic of Spanish brutality. He and others were able to pressure the Spanish King Emperor Charles V to ban the worst abuses of the encomenda system. To deal with the massive loss of indigenous life, the Europeans imported African slaves. This was the start of the slave trade in the Americas. Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuit missionaries converted indigenous people to Christianity. They also taught European methods of agriculture to the indigenous people and instilled loyalty to colonial masters. If a colony had European women and children present, the settlements took on European languages, religions, and ways of life. However, when European women and children were not present, Europeans assimilated themselves to the culture of the local populations. The English drew strict boundaries between civilized and savage. This was to prevent Englishmen from making unions with native women. The French had low levels of immigration. Because of this, the French began to encourage, initially, French traders to form ties with native women. The Spanish word mestizo described people of mixed Native American and European descent. This created complex feelings of self-identity for the Spanish. The new process of the exchange of goods between the Americas and Europe was called the Columbian Exchange. Columbus brought sugar plants over, the Spanish brought rice and beans, the Spanish and Portuguese brought wheat. The Native Americans had no animals for food except wild turkey and game. On Columbus's second voyage, he brought horses, cattle, sheep, dogs, pigs, chickens, and goats. Europeans also returned home with many new food crops that became central elements of their diets. Originally, slavery was not based on race. Europe lost its flow of the slave trade from the Ottomans, and therefore went to Africa. In 1444 was the first year that the slaves traveled from Africa to Lisbon. Portuguese merchants traded with local African leaders. They traded guns for slaves. On the trip over, men were kept in chains, women were available to sailors, and 20% of the slaves died from dysentery on the trip. This was because of poor quality of food, overcrowding, and lack of sanitation. About 10 million Africans were traded. Sugar increased the demand for slaves. This was because it was a difficult crop that needed to be planted by hand, harvested, and processed rapidly, and had a constant growing season. Spain's source of wealth was from the silver of the Patacy territory in the Inca Empire. 60% of the world's silver came from the Patacy. Muslims and Jews expelled from Spain decreased the number of laborers and left Spain in high demand of workers. Spain's inability to meet demands of the trading led to inflation. King Philip and his successors wrote off the debt, which in turn undermined the confidence in the government and deteriorated the economy. Noblemen suffered from this inflation the most because they were living on a fixed income. The middle class and merchants prospered because they were not on a fixed income. The Portuguese were the first worldwide traders. They traded with Goa in the Arabian Sea, Malacca in the Malay Peninsula, Macau in China, Nagasaki in Japan, and Manila in the Philippines. The Dutch Indian Trading Company was founded in 1602. Their empire was built upon spices such as cloves and nutmeg. They won the loyalty of the Indonesian princes and controlled Indonesian trade by the 1660s. They also brought trade to the Americas but were unable to colonize it.
In most Europeans' eyes, Africans were the lowest category of race. Among the lower races were also the Irish, Jews, and Muslim infidels. As Europeans turned to Africa as a new source of slaves, they used the ideas of Africans' barbarity to defend slavery. They would even went so far as to say that the enslavement benefited Africans by bringing them to Christ. Black skin became equivalent with the slavery itself. The idea derived from Aristotle's argument about the association between darkness and sin. After 1700s, the new methods of observing nature led to the definition of race as being biologically distinct groups of people whose physical differences produce differences in intelligence. Discovery of new cultures in the New World and religious unrest in the Old World contributed to racial schools of thought. One such example included skepticism, which said that total certainty is not attainable. There is also cultural relativism, which said that one culture is not necessarily superior to another, just different. Frenchman Michel de Montaigne developed the essay to express his thoughts and ideas. Master of literary creativity in this period, William Shakespeare wrote many plays famous for their depth and elegant language and characterization. His works revealed the impact of his new discoveries and context of his life. The title character of Othello was black. This shows Shakespeare's efforts to demonstrate the intolerance of society.
Pope Paul III in the papal court became the center of the reform, rather than the opponent of the reform. In 1542, they established the Supreme Sacred Congregation of Roman and Universal Inquisition, also known as the Holy Office. The goal of the Holy Office was to doctrine internal heresy. The judicial authority over all Catholics consisted of 6 cardinals. These cardinals had the ability to arrest, imprison, and execute suspected heretics. The Holy Office also published the Index of Prohibited Books, which contained works by Christian humanists. Most of the power of the Holy Office was concentrated in the Papal States. The Holy Office also established the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent invited Protestants and Calvinists to discuss scriptures in a civilized manner. The Council of Trent gave validity to scripture and traditions, reaffirming the 7 sacraments, and dealt with the disciplinary matters such as pluralism, indulgences, seminary education, and simony. Theoretically, the purpose of the Council of Trent was to soften conflict between the Catholics and Protestants, but in reality, the Council of Trent only reaffirmed Catholic beliefs.